I'm not proud of this. I don't even know why I'm writing it, honestly. Maybe because keeping it in my head feels worse than admitting it somewhere anonymous. Or maybe I just want someone to understand how a person ends up crossing a line they swore they never would. My name's William. Mid-30s, corporate job, decent salary, nothing flashy. On paper, I'm the kind of guy people trust, reliable, quiet, the one who stays late and fixes things no one else wants to deal with. That's probably why what I did worked at all. The crime? Corporate espionage. Yeah, it sounds dramatic. It felt dramatic too, but not at first. At first, it felt like survival. I worked for a mid-sized tech firm that was slowly bleeding out. Layoffs every quarter, leadership pretending everything was strategic restructuring. Meanwhile, rumors kept swirling about our biggest competitor, how they were always one step ahead, releasing products suspiciously similar to ours, just better, faster, cheaper. Then one night, after too many drinks with a colleague who trusted me a little too much, I heard something that changed everything. "They've got someone on the inside," he said. "No way they move that fast otherwise." I laughed it off at the time. But the idea stuck. Because if they had someone on the inside, what was stopping us from doing the same? Or more specifically, what was stopping me? I didn't wake up the next day planning to commit a crime. That's the part people never get. It wasn't some grand decision. It was a series of small, quiet justifications. I told myself I was just gathering information. Everyone does shady stuff in corporate. I needed leverage if layoffs hit my team next. And then, one day, I realized I had access. Not directly, but close enough. That's when the thought stopped being hypothetical. That's when it became a plan. I didn't jump into it right away. For about a week after that conversation, I just observed, like I'd suddenly put on a different pair of glasses. Things I'd never paid attention to before started standing out. Who had access to what? Which systems talked to each other? Where the gaps were. I worked in IT operations, which meant I wasn't building products, but I had visibility into the infrastructure, permissions, device management, internal tools. The boring stuff most people ignored. Turns out boring is where the doors are left unlocked. The competitor, let's call them Orion, used a shared vendor for one of their analytics platforms. Same vendor we used. That overlap became my first thread to pull. I started mapping connections. Vendor portals, shared authentication methods, support tickets. I wasn't hacking anything, not in the movie sense. I was just noticing how loosely everything was stitched together. The idea formed slowly. If I couldn't break in directly, maybe I could blend in somewhere between systems. That's when I realized something unsettling. I didn't feel scared. I felt curious. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when you give it time to grow. It starts asking questions you don't really want to answer, but you answer them anyway. I told myself I was just testing. That word made it sound harmless. Like I was still on the right side of the line. The first thing I did was access the shared vendor dashboard using my legitimate credentials. Nothing unusual there. I'd done it dozens of times for routine maintenance. But this time, I wasn't looking at our data. I was looking at the structure. Folders. Client identifiers. API keys partially masked but still visible enough to understand patterns. It wasn't access, it was proximity. And proximity, I realized, can be just as powerful. I created a dummy support request under a generic internal ticket, pretending there was a syncing issue. The goal wasn't to fix anything. It was to see how the vendor responded, what information they revealed without being asked directly. They replied within hours. Helpful. Detailed. Too detailed. That was the moment it shifted. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was probing. Once I saw how much the vendor was willing to share, it became less about if I could get closer to Orion's data and more about how carefully I could do it without raising suspicion. I started small. Follow-up tickets, each one slightly more specific than the last. I'd reference intermittent cross-client discrepancies, knowing it sounded vague enough to justify a deeper explanation. And every time, support handed me just a little more context. Names of data streams, internal labels, even screenshots, sanitized, sure, but not enough. That's when I noticed something I shouldn't have, a pattern in their client IDs. Ours followed a predictable format, and Orion's looked similar. Not identical, but close enough to guess the logic behind them. I remember sitting there late at night, staring at my screen, cursor blinking. It felt like standing at the edge of something. All I had to do was try. One small input. One guess. Worst case? It fails. Best case? I see something I was never meant to see. I wish I could say there was some dramatic build-up, but honestly, it happened in a few quiet seconds. I entered a modified client ID into a request field. Just a slight variation based on the pattern I'd been studying. My heart was beating harder than it should have been for something so small. It felt ridiculous, until it wasn't. At first, nothing. Then the page refreshed. And there it was. Not full access, nothing that obvious. But metadata. Enough to confirm I'd crossed into Orion space. Project names, timestamps, activity logs. It was like peeking through a keyhole and realizing the door wasn't locked after all. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen. I remember laughing under my breath, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe it worked. That was the moment everything changed. Up until then, I could pretend I was experimenting. Now I had proof. And instead of closing the window and walking away, I took a screenshot. Just in case. That first screenshot sat on my phone for 2 days before I touched anything again. I kept opening it, zooming in on meaningless details like timestamps and project labels, trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. But it was. It was access, even if partial, and access has a way of pulling you back in. I knew one thing: if I was going to continue, I couldn't rely on random guesses every time. That was sloppy. Sloppy gets noticed. So I started organizing. I created a private note on my phone, disguised as a grocery list app. Every detail I'd seen, ID patterns, naming conventions, timing of updates, I logged it. Quietly. Methodically. Like I was solving a puzzle no one else knew existed. Then I set rules for myself. Never access during peak hours. Never repeat the same query twice. Never pull too much at once. It sounds controlled when I say it like that. Disciplined. But really, I was just trying to convince myself I wasn't spiraling. Because deep down I knew. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was intent. Once I had a system, everything became smoother, and that was the dangerous part. The friction was gone. No more hesitation, no more. What if this fails? It was just process. Login. Check timing. Input variation. Observe. Repeat. Over the next couple of weeks, I expanded what I could see. Still nothing explosive on its own, but patterns started emerging. Product timelines. Feature rollouts. Internal testing phases. Orion wasn't just ahead of us, they were predictable. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. Because predictability is power. I started cross-referencing what I found with our own company's roadmap. Late at night, spreadsheets open, connecting dots no one had asked me to connect. And suddenly things made sense. Why we kept losing bids, why our launches felt outdated before they even happened. I told myself I was helping. That if I understood the gap, maybe I could close it. But I wasn't sharing this with anyone. Not yet. Because a part of me didn't want to help the company. A part of me wanted control. Up until this point, everything I'd taken was abstract. Fragments. Pieces of a puzzle that only made sense because I forced them together. But then I stumbled onto something different. Something complete. It was buried behind a slightly different query format, One I hadn't tried before because it seemed too obvious. Ironically, that's what made it invisible. When I finally did test it, I expected another dead end. Instead, I got a document preview. A full internal briefing. Product specs, pricing strategy, launch windows, everything laid out in one place like it was meant to be read by executives, not someone like me sneaking in through a side door. I remember my hands actually shaking this time. This wasn't peeking anymore. This was theft. I hesitated longer than I ever had before. Closed the window. Opened it again. Stared at the screen like it might disappear if I blinked too long. I knew exactly what I should do. Report it. Walk away. Pretend I never saw it. Instead, I reached for my phone. Taking that document changed something fundamental in me. A screenshot was one thing, easy to dismiss, easy to forget. But this was tangible. Detailed. Valuable in a way I couldn't pretend not to understand. I didn't just capture it, I studied it. Every page, every line. I saved copies in places I thought no one would ever think to look. Encrypted folders, renamed files, even fragments stored separately like I was afraid of having it all in one place. It sounds paranoid, but at the time, it felt like being careful. The strangest part? I started thinking about what I could do with it. At first, I imagined anonymously sending it to my company's leadership. Some kind of whistleblower angle. But that didn't sit right. Too many questions, too much risk of it tracing back to me. Then another thought crept in. What if I didn't give it away? What if I used it? That's when the situation stopped being about survival, and started being about choice. I wish I could say I wrestled with the decision longer than I did. That there was some deep moral battle, sleepless nights, weighing right and wrong. There wasn't. Once the idea settled in, that I could use what I had, it became a question of execution, not ethics. I started small, subtle. I adjusted internal recommendations during planning meetings. Nothing dramatic, just nudges. Suggesting we deprioritize certain features I knew Orion would beat us to. Pushing for timelines that conveniently avoided their launch windows. No one questioned it. Why would they? I'd built a reputation for being cautious, analytical. The guy who looked at the data. And technically I was. Just not our data. The first time one of my suggestions played out exactly as I expected, I felt it, that rush. Not relief, not even satisfaction. Control. It was quiet, almost invisible to everyone else. But I knew. I was steering outcomes using information no one else had. And that realization did something dangerous. It made me feel smarter than everyone in the room. For a while, everything worked too well. That should have been my warning sign. Projects started aligning better. We avoided a couple of bad launches. Leadership even praised our improved strategic foresight. Hearing that in meetings felt surreal, like being congratulated for something I hadn't earned. But patterns don't just exist in data. People noticed them too. Her name was Elena, product manager, sharp, the kind of person who didn't let things slide just because they seemed right. She started asking questions. At first, casually. How did you come to that conclusion? Why are we so confident about their timeline? Normal questions. Reasonable ones. But she asked them every time. I brushed it off. Gave vague answers. Talked about trend analysis and industry signals. It worked, until it didn't. One afternoon, she pulled me aside after a meeting. Closed the door. Looked straight at me and said, "This isn't guesswork, William. So what is it?" And for the first time since all of this started, I didn't have an easy answer. That conversation with Elena didn't explode into some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. I deflected. Gave her a slightly more polished version of the same vague answers. Talked about aggregated signals and cross-referenced vendor insights. Enough jargon to sound convincing, not enough detail to be pinned down. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, like she was filing something away for later. That's what got to me. After that, I started noticing small shifts. A few more people looping into meetings I used to handle alone. Requests to document methodology. Harmless on the surface, but it felt like the walls were inching closer. So I adjusted. I pulled back on using the data directly. Slowed down the frequency. Tried to make my suggestions less precise, less predictive. But that created a new problem. Now my insights weren't as accurate. And people noticed that too. I was stuck in between. Too good, and I'd raise suspicion. Too normal, and I'd lose the edge I'd created. That's when the anxiety really started to set in. It didn't fall apart all at once. It was one small mistake, almost invisible, the kind you only notice in hindsight. We were in a strategy meeting, discussing a potential product shift. The conversation was going in circles, no clear direction. I'd been quiet, trying not to stand out too much. Then someone asked, "Any final thoughts?" And I spoke. I suggested a pivot, specific, confident, backed by reasoning that, in my head, made perfect sense. But as soon as I finished, I felt it. That subtle shift in the room. Elena didn't say anything immediately. She just looked at me, the same way she had before, but this time, there was no curiosity. Just confirmation. Because what I'd said hadn't been announced anywhere. Not in industry news, not in public filings. Only internally. At Orion. I tried to walk it back, soften it, frame it as speculation. But it was too late. The damage wasn't in the words. It was in the certainty behind them. And she'd caught it. The meeting ended like nothing had happened, but I knew better. You can feel when something shifts beyond repair. By the next morning, I was pulled into a routine review. HR, IT, security, and my manager all in one room. That alone told me everything. They didn't accuse me right away. They asked questions. Access logs. Vendor interactions. My methodology. Calm, methodical, almost polite. But every answer I gave felt thinner than the last. Because the truth, the real truth, was sitting right behind everything I said. Then they showed me the logs. Timestamps I recognized instantly. Queries I thought were untraceable. Patterns I'd convinced myself were invisible. They didn't have everything. But they had enough. I remember the exact moment it hit me. This wasn't about whether I'd get away with it anymore. That possibility was gone. This was about consequences. I didn't confess outright, but I stopped fighting. There's a point where denial just makes things worse. Walking out of that room, I felt strangely calm. Like the worst part had already happened. I didn't end up in handcuffs. No dramatic arrest, no courtroom scenes like you see in movies. But don't mistake that for getting away with it. I was terminated within a week. Officially for gross misconduct and violation of company policy. Unofficially, everyone knew. There was an internal investigation, and I had to sign more documents than I can even remember, NDAs, compliance statements, agreements not to pursue anything further. Orion was notified too. I don't know what happened on their side, and honestly, I didn't want to know. The worst part wasn't losing the job. It was losing the version of myself I thought I was. For a long time, I told myself I was just adapting. Being smart. Doing what it took to stay ahead. But looking back, I see it clearly. I crossed the line, and then I kept walking like it didn't matter. If you're reading this and thinking you could control something like this, you can't. It starts small. Always small. And by the time it feels big, it's already too late.